Welcome to the second lecture in our series on the nervous system. Today we'll tackle that mesmerizing topic of electrophysiology. And as you can see from this graphic, the neuron is capable of the creation and transmission of electrical waves, which at their foundation rely on the movement of those electrolytes, sodium and potassium. In our last lecture, I alluded to the fact that this unit gives us an opportunity to integrate biology, chemistry, physics, and psychology. And today we'll delve into this relationship through the subdiscipline of electrophysiology. So, electrophysiology is at its core an electrical phenomenon. So put on your thinking caps because this will get pretty heady. And let's take a second to consider some basics. We can use the word polarization quite a bit in physiology, but it can also have a useful translation for understanding physics. Consider a ball that I hold above the ground at a certain distance. We say that it has a specific value called its potential energy. That's a function of its mass, the acceleration due to gravity, and its height. You could say that the ball is polarized with respect to the ground. It wants to go there with a quantity we call potential energy, but it can't. I'm holding it back. When I release the ball, it will convert all of that potential energy into the energy of movement or kinetic energy. We can measure kinetic energy in terms of its velocity. So what's that got to do with a battery? Well, again, polarization really means to separate things, right? And depolarization is when they come back together or move to where they want to be. So when you look at a battery, you've probably seen the positive and negative sign. We say that the battery has poles, and that's because there are charged particles that are separated in the interior of the battery. Okay, and we can say that they have an electrical potential energy, and we measure that electrical potential energy as voltage. Now, just like the ball that wanted to get to the ground, this potential energy, this attraction between positive and negative poles, allows us to create electrical kinetic energy. And electrical kinetic energy is measured as current, and we use the value or the units of amperes to measure electrical kinetic energy. And in order to make this battery move its electrical charges, electrons in the case of a battery, I have to complete the circuit. That is, I have to connect somehow the positive and negative poles. Well, we do that in physiology just simply by moving ions. And the ions that we're going to talk about are sodium and potassium. So electrophysiology is the measurement of polarized ions, right? Ions that are separated. We measure our values in millivolts, they're small charges, and we measure the electrical wave as those ions move in milliamperes. And so those ions are going to want to go from a polarized state to a depolarized state as they move to go to equilibrium. What am I talking about? Well, we measure voltage differences in the neuron by placing an electrode outside the neuron and one inside the neuron, right? So we're measuring the potential difference across the membrane of this cell. And we measure that value, the difference in charge between the interior of the cell and the exterior cell, as something called resting membrane potential. Okay, so there's a difference in charge, and that value is minus 70 millivolts, all right, for neurons, as well as muscular tissue. And it's the result of an electrochemical gradient created by the membrane transport protein called the NAK ATPase. You might know it as a sodium potassium pump, but it's at the basis of our electrophysiology, right? It's at the basis for our ability to transmit electrical messages from our brain to muscles, and it's at the basis for the ability for those muscles to depolarize and move as well. So, the resting membrane potential is the result of an electrochemical gradient that's created by the NAK-ATPase. And the NAK-ATPase is remarkable because it imports 2 potassium ions into the interior of the cell, and it exports 3 sodium ions to the exterior of the cell at a cost of 1 ATP. All right, so again, the NAK-ATPase throws 3 sodiums out, throws 2 potassiums in at the same time, and burns an ATP, turns it back into ADP. So this creates a chemical gradient, right? Number one, I've got all the sodium outside the cell and a bunch of potassium inside the cell. And if you'll recollect from what we learned about cell transport, nature abhors a concentration gradient, right? The second law of thermodynamics says that's no good. That's in a sense an organization, right? We don't like organization in the universe. So anyway, sodium wants to get in, but it can't. Potassium wants to get out, but it can't. Remember, they're both ions, so they have charge, so they don't pass through the cell membrane. There are channels for them to get through, but they're always they're closed. They're closed. They're closed for now. All right. So I've got a chemical gradient. Well, the other thing that's odd about the NAK-ATPase is this differential export of these ions, right? I throw 3 positive charges out, and I throw 2 positive charges in, and even though they're both positive charges, what happens is I create a relative condition. In fact, all electrical phenomenon are terms of, they have to be relative. You can't be negative unless there's something that's near you that's less negative, which will make it positive. All right. So even though sodium and potassium are both positively charged ions, I've got a lot more of those positively charged ions outside the cell, and that makes the cell's interior slightly negatively charged, right? And that charge is negative 70 millivolts. So we say that we have both a chemical and an electrical gradient, an electrochemical gradient. Sodium wants to come in, potassium wants to go out, and there's a charge there. Okay, so we can have local potential changes in the membrane, and that can be the result of a couple of things. You know, I can use the actions of neurotransmitters. Remember, acetylcholine opened up its receptor, which was a sodium channel, all right? So that opened sodium channels, and that allows for depolarization, right? The sodium will rush into the cell, and the cell will become less negative. It'll become depolarized. It'll go towards 0. I can also have temperature changes that cause local potential changes. Even mechanical forces, right? If you press on your finger right now, you'll actually compress pacinial corpuscles, which are nerve tissue, and that'll open up some sodium ion gates, and you'll feel that because it'll create a wave of depolarization that'll travel right up to your sensory cortex. All right. So if the membrane potential becomes more negative, we say it's become hyperpolarized, and we'll see hyperpolarization later. But if it becomes more positive, it's depolarizing. All right. And we say that that there's a phenomenon called graded summation. That is, I can have little tiny events of depolarization that lead to this idea of a threshold, right? So there's a specific value, a specific voltage value. It's minus 55, all right? So if I go from negative 70 to minus 55, I've hit a threshold. And that threshold starts a phenomenon called the action potential. And this happens on the neuron at the axon hillock, okay? So graded summation, the decision for a neuron to fire occurs at the axon hillock. All right, so the threshold stimulus is anything that depolarizes the membrane enough to get to negative 55, which is exactly when voltage-gated sodium ion channels will open. All right, so there's sodium ion channels that are peppering the axons and the neuron itself. And whenever the membrane potential gets up to minus 55 from negative 70, those channels open, sodium rushes in, and it starts a wave of depolarization, right? And as the axon hillock depolarizes, that causes the axon adjacent to it to depolarize, which causes the tissue just downstream of it to depolarize as these sodium channels open and I flood sodium into the axon. Whenever I moved charged particles, positive or negative, I have an electrical phenomenon, all right? And we call that phenomenon the action potential. So remember, at rest, the membranes polarize. When I reach a threshold stimulus, sodium, voltage gauged sodium ions channels open up. Sodium rushes into the cell, and you can see that right here I've got this measurement, right? So remember I said I can measure voltage, right? So if I've got my two little electrodes in the interior and the exterior, right, I'm at negative 70. When those sodium ion channels open, what happens? Well, the cell's interior becomes more positively charged, right? So I have these threshold stimulus. Once I hit minus 55, all those gates open and I start to depolarize. There's a couple of events that happen here, but in general, I just want you to realize that, opening sodium channels here will cause the opening of sodium channels down the road because they're all voltage gated. All right, so the particulars of the action potential are thus, okay? Number one, I have this I have this resting potential, right? And I have these graded summation here, till I get to this negative 55. That's the threshold, right? At that point, sodium ion channels open. The cell undergoes depolarization. Halfway up this groove, the potassium ions channels open as well, okay? And potassium starts to rush out of the cell. At plus 30 around, once I go through zero, I'm becoming hyperpolarized. At plus 30, those sodium ions channels snap shut. Now the sodium potassium pump is always working. It's always trying to throw sodium out, potassium in. And through that action, it starts to repolarize the cell. At a certain point, I'll always overshoot my resting potential. Sodium channels will open again. Eventually, I'll return to resting potential. And there's an absolute time of refraction, that is the inability for this neuron to fire. So this is the absolute refractory period. And then there's a relative refractory period that, it takes a while for this neuron to get back to its original state. So this is a finite ability for neurons to fire. So again, the sequence is this. I have a membrane resting potential. Neurons receive a stimulation, cause local potentials, whether it's the acetylcholine or some other excitatory neurotransmitter. Sodium channels open. They cause adjacent sodium channels to open, and then you have this wave of depolarization that travels down the axon. And we say that it's propagated, and it can propagate at like, I don't know, 100 kilometers per second, 480 miles an hour. It can go really fast, or it can go slow as well. But we have this long depolarization of the axon. In fact, remember I talked about myelin and the myelin sheath. And in this illustration, you can see that the depolarization, this electrical wave, will take a while. It would take a while for me to depolarize the whole axon, especially considering I've got axons that go from my brain to my pelvis, and from my pelvis all the way down to my feet. They could be a meter long in length. So the purpose of myelin, as I told you, was to insulate the axon to prevent the degradation of the signal. But more importantly, they actually allow the axon to depolarize here to here, and then it'll jump. And it'll depolarize here, and then here, and then here, and then here, and rapidly increase the speed of propagation in a process called saltatory conduction. Okay? So saltatory conduction is a result of these jump of depolarizations from one node of Ranvier to the next. And that brings us to the end of the neuron, where we find the synapse, which is the topic of our next lecture. I've got some activities for you to work on to help clear some of these things up. Thanks for your time and patience.